Over the last couple of years, we've seen a trend developing in the all-in-one CPU cooler market. All the major players in the game now seem to have at least one version of their cooler featuring an LCD display. That trend in 2022 seems to be migrating towards cases. A couple of months ago, I reviewed the Cooler Master HAF 700 Evo. That was a huge super tower case, but it featured a multifunction LCD display on the front panel. And now it looks like Thermaltake is joining in on the fun too, with the new Divider 550 TG Ultra. So the Thermaltake Divider 550 TG Ultra is here. This is available to purchase from the 28th of April for consumers in the EU and the UK. You can pick this up at the Thermaltake Premium website and it's going to cost around €340. If you're in the UK, it'll all depend on what your bank does with conversion rates. Currently, if you convert euros to pounds, €339, which this will be, converts roughly to about £280, which sounds expensive for a case, but in today's market prices are all over the place, so it's not unexpected to pay something like that for a case with a special feature such as this 3.9-inch LCD display on the front panel. The Divider 550 TG Ultra is based on the Divider 500 chassis. The internal structure is basically identical. Differences between the 500 and the 550, the side panels are slightly different. We don't have the 50-50 split in the side panel on the 550 Ultra, and obviously the LCD display on the front panel. There are a couple of things that concern me about this case without even diving in and having a good look at it. One thing is the price, it's a bit expensive. The second is the amount of tempered glass. So the front, the top and the side are all solid tempered glass panels, so airflow in the front, airflow coming out of the top is going to be compromised, but we'll take a closer look at that later when we do some airflow testing and temperature testing on the case. But as you can see on the front, you've got a 3mm thick closed tempered glass panel, small vent down either side of the front panel. The front panel removes pretty easily. You just give it a push and it's just located on a couple of pins down either side. There is a slight tint in the tempered glass, but it's not too dark, you can still see into the case quite easily. Side panels are held on with thumb screws, which are captive, and then the side panel just slides out, and as you can see again, this has a mild tint to it, so you will be able to see into the system pretty easily, but it will kind of darken the interior a little. And then the top panel again, simply just pops off, again located on some pins, and again it has that mild tint to it. And as you can quite clearly see, up at the top here is the LCD display, and this is another problem I've got with the case. I think Thermaltake has missed a trick here with this LCD display, because it's fitted up here at the top and it seems to be that is the only place you can fit it in the case. Now for me, that's probably not too bad for those people that have the case up on the desk next to them, although if it's kind of angled off to the side and they're looking in to the side of the case, then having this up here is a bit pointless. But for me, it would have been good to be able to move locations of this depending on, you know, where you have your case. So if you had your case on the floor, it would have been good to be able to remove this and maybe put it on the top, maybe remove the front I/O and put it in that position. And then maybe if you do have your case up on your desk with the side pointing out, it'd be nice to be able to move this maybe down here somewhere, or maybe on top of the power supply shroud or something like that. So although it's a decent addition having an LCD display, and for some people it might come in useful to have system information or whatever there, it would have been better, I think, if you could have moved it around, or even alternatively if you could just completely take it out of the case and maybe just pop it on your desk next to your mouse pad under your monitor or something like that, connect it up by USB. That would have been even better. Obviously that LCD display is the main feature and the main talking point about this Divider 550 TG Ultra, But there are some other features as well that I think are pretty useful that have transferred over from the Divider 500. In terms of cooling, you've got 320mm ARGB fans. They come pre-installed as standard. You can also fit 340mm fans in the front, or alternatively, you can fit up to a 360mm radiator or a 280 or a 240. You can also see on this front panel there's a few screws, so there's 2 on either side. You remove those screws and then you can remove the radiator bracket, fit your radiator or fans out of the case and then reinstall it back in as a whole unit. On the top of the case is the front I/O connectivity. So on here there's power and reset buttons, 3.5mm audio jacks for headphones and microphones, 2 USB 3.0 Type A ports, and then a single USB 3.2 Gen 2 Type C port. So this is a mid-tower ATX chassis. It's not the biggest, it's pretty compact, especially in terms of the depth from front to back. And you can see also it accepts up to ATX motherboards, so also micro ATX, mini ATX as well. In terms of clearances, so the CPU cooler, maximum CPU cooler height is 170mm, and then maximum graphics card length, if you have just fans installed up front, like the current configuration, you can fit a graphics card up to 390mm long, but if you were to install a radiator up front, so behind the fan bracket, you'd be looking at 360mm maximum graphics card. Like the front panel, there's just some screws holding the top radiator bracket in. So again, undo 4 screws out of the top and the whole radiator bracket removes. In here you can fit up to 220 or 240mm fans, so the fans can fit on the top. So they're actually kind of on the outside of the chassis frame, and you can fit a radiator underneath, so up to 280mm radiators. Also a 240 can fit on there. That extra depth there for the fans allows probably a bit more space inside the case. So your radiator's on this side, fans are on that side, leaving you a little bit more room around your VRM heat sinks and memory as well. So it looks like CPU cooler and radiator installation should be pretty easy in this case. Also, as you can see on the back panel, you get just a plain black 120mm fan pre-installed. Obviously you can also fit up to 120mm radiators in there as well. And you can see down the side of the motherboard tray, there's another panel here, and a thumb screw holds it in, but it's a little bit tight from the factory. And if you undo that thumb screw, this panel just pulls out. This is actually for mounting 2.5-inch SSDs. So if you've got the panel in that way around and you want to mount some SSDs on the outside, you can fit 3 2.5-inch SSDs on here. Alternatively, if you spin it over, you can fit 2 2.5-inch SSDs on the inside of this panel. So when you put it back in place, the SSDs are actually hidden from view from this side, and you can roll your cables and everything through pretty easily. Then alternatively, if you don't want to have this SSD panel installed at all, that opens up another place for cooling. So here you can have up to 220mm fans or a 240mm radiator positioned at the side of the motherboard. Then round the back of the case, it's pretty typical layout. 120mm fan grill, rear I/O cut out there, 7 PCI slots as usual for a mid-tower case, and then right at the bottom is the power supply mount. And you can see if you just undo these 4 screws, it's one of those power supply mountings where you actually screw this bracket to your power supply and then you slide all the power supply in from the back. Also around the back of the case is a very handy feature for those of you that want to mount the graphics card vertically. This panel here that covers the PCIe slots, just have to remove that first. Again, these thumb screws are a bit tight from the factory, so you can remove that, and then you can see there's 4 more screws. Just take those out. And then with those 4 screws out, you can just slide the PCIe brackets and then just slot them into that position. Pop the 4 screws back in again. And then you have a vertical graphics card mount there built into the case. The great thing about this as well is it's not just a 2-slot right over at the side, very close to the tempered glass. And you can see if you look in on the power supply shroud, there's a few different places where you can take this bracket out of the accessory pack. So this is the vertical mount bracket, and then that will just slot in to one of these three positions. So your graphics card isn't going to be crushed right up against the side panel. You can decide how far you want it within reason on these three positions, how far you want it from your motherboard. If you're wondering what else comes in the accessories pack, there's not a lot. There's just a few mounting screws for motherboard and hard drives, etc. A few plastic zip ties. There's an RGB cable, a motherboard speaker, and then some of those Velcro cable ties. Then around the right hand side of the case, you can see Thermaltake has gone back to the 50-50 split divider style side panel again. This is just held in place with a couple of thumb screws for the bottom part of the panel, and it just slides off. It's a bit awkward, no sound dampening material or anything on there. And then this top part of the split panel is just clipped in place again with those pins, and on here there's a vent for the side mount radiator or side mount fan, and that is covered up by a perforated metal dust filter that's magnetic. Because there is this radiator stroke fan mount down this side, you look rather limited in terms of cable management. It's all towards the back of the case, and then the depth between the motherboard tray and the side panel, you've got around about 22 millimeters, which it's not the most generous ever, but it's not bad. It's pretty similar to what we'd see in cases of this style and this price range. You've got quite a bit of wiring going on already back here before you've installed your system. Obviously there's all the front panel wiring, the pre-installed fans, and then there's the USB wiring to the 3.9 inch LCD display on the front. There is also additional SSD mounts here, so you've got two of these removable SSD mounts. So again, these are just held to the motherboard tray with a thumb screw. Just mount your SSD to that and then pop it back in position. And then below the power supply shroud, we've got a 3.5 inch drive bay here. There's two plastic trays or caddies that pull out. Mount your 3.5 inch drive in there through the side with screws, then you can slide it back in position. There's also mounts on here for 2.5 inch SSDs. So in total, you could fit a lot of storage in this case if you're using 2.5 inch drives. So you've got 3 down the side, 2 here, and then 2 in the caddies below. So storage looks good. If we just pop the case down on its side and look at the floor, you can see there are 4 feet with anti-vibration rubbers. These raise the case up and give it about 20 to 25 millimeters ground clearance, allowing for some airflow underneath the case. And as you can see, there's a filter that covers the whole of the bottom of the case, and that just slides out from the back. There you can see the mounting screws for the hard drive caddy. Remove those 4 screws and the hard drive caddy comes out completely. Normally at this point in a case review, I'd be picking a bunch of parts, building a system inside the case, running some thermal performance tests, and then I'd come back with my opinions on how easy it is to build a system and how well the case performs. I've noticed recently that maybe that's becoming a bit repetitive with the parts that I'm choosing, so I'm going to try and spice things up a little bit today by leaving the system spec in the hands of the random selector gods. So there are a couple of things that I'm kind of forced to use because Thermaltake has sent over an all-in-one CPU cooler, this Flow RC Ultra 240. So this is a CPU and memory all-in-one CPU cooler, and as you can see, it has LCD displays on both the CPU block and the memory block. And also Thermaltake sent me this Thermaltake Tough RAM RC. This is DDR4 3200 megahertz. It's a 16 gigabyte kit, but it's 2 8 gigabyte modules, and that works with this AO. So we're stuck with using that, but for the rest of the system spec, it's down to the random selector. So first I'm going to randomly select the CPU. Just to make sure there's no problems with compatibility, I've kind of stuck to an AMD based system in terms of CPU and motherboard. So let's see what the random selector chooses for a CPU. Not a bad choice. Looks like we've got an AMD Ryzen 7 5800X. Actually, that'll be a really good CPU to test the thermal performance of this case, because it is a bit of a pain to keep cool. Give the motherboard a spin. Interesting choice. The ROG Crosshair 7 Hero, slightly older platform, but X470 still decent. Now let's have a look at what M.2 storage we're going to use. The Corsair MP510, so that's a PCIe Gen 3 NVMe M.2 drive. Graphics card, this should be an interesting one. Let's see what graphics card we're going to be using. Got a few more choices here with this. That is an interesting choice. So we're going with the Aorus Radeon RX 5700 XT. And then finally, let's see what the random selector chooses for the power supply. Now that is a good choice. The Silverstone Nightjaw NJ700, it's a 700 watt fanless power supply, and the OEM for that is Seasonic. So I like that choice. So the random generator has chosen the system spec. So we've got an AMD Ryzen 7 5800X CPU. Motherboard is the Asus ROG Crosshair Hero 7 Wi-Fi motherboard. For storage, it's a Corsair MP510 480GB, and this is a PCIe Gen 3x4 M.2 NVMe. Memory is the Thermaltake ToughRAM RC. Graphics card is this Aorus RX 5700 XT card. And then CPU cooler is the Flow RC Ultra 240 CPU and memory all-in-one CPU cooler. And then power supply is the Silverstone Nightjaw NJ700, and that's a 700 watt fanless power supply. No idea how this is going to go. Let's find out. So the system's actually turned out looking pretty good. I think the random parts generator seems to have done a decent job. It's quite a stealthy looking system. Yeah, I'm happy with how it's turned out, but that's not what we're here to talk about. We're here to talk about the case, and it's a bit of a mixed bag really. In terms of the system installation, I don't really have a problem. Everything lined up perfectly, motherboard standoffs, the PCIe slot cutouts, things like that, we're all well lined up. There's no issue, you know, putting the graphics card in or lining up the motherboard or anything like that, so that's good. Cable management's a little bit tight around this side because you've only got 2/3 at best to manage cables, but the main channel that runs kind of in the center, it's deep enough to get most of the cables in there and make a pretty tidy job of it. Installation of the power supply from the back is useful as well. It makes it a little bit easier than trying to squash everything in from the side, so that's good. And you've still got a bit of space to hide cables in between the power supply and the 3.5-inch drive bay, so that's good as well. In terms of the looks of this case, it does look great. I'm not usually a fan of tempered glass cases with multiple tempered glass panels like on the top and the front and stuff, but as far as those type of cases go, this is a really good looking one. The clarity of the glass is really good. You've got the 3 RGB fans up front, which are nice to see. I would have liked to have seen another RGB fan in the rear and maybe 2 more in the top as well for people that are possibly using a CPU air cooler. I think in this price range, Thermaltake could have squeezed that in. The only problem with these fans is they are proprietary connections and they connect up to the Thermaltake fan controller, so it's not like you can disconnect them from that if you don't want to use that and connect them up to the motherboard easily. You have to do some modding of the cables to get them to work. If you want to control the RGB of the fans, the reset button on the top of the case can be used to do that, so instead of being connected up to the motherboard, it's connected up to the fan controller and you can just scroll through the various different RGB colours and patterns, or you could just use a solid colour. So that's pretty simple. The removable radiator brackets or fan brackets at the front and the top are also a nice feature. It does make it slightly easier probably to install everything to those brackets and then screw the bracket in place, rather than having to sometimes fiddle about with fans on the front of the radiator and like squashed in between and trying to get screws through while it's all held upright. So that's, again, nice feature to have. It also allows you on the top to install the fans kind of on the outside of the bracket, so they're away from the motherboard. It gives you a bit more space to the motherboard, so if you've got tall memory, which we've got in this, as you can see with this AIO cooler, with the RAM cooler, it doesn't leave you much space at the top of the case, so having the fans on the opposite side of the radiator, pulling the air out away from the motherboard, is definitely a useful feature. The only problem with that is it moves the fans a bit closer to this top tempered glass panel. Obviously that's going to hurt the airflow, strangle airflow, and hurt the thermal performance a little. I'll come back to that in a bit because that's something I want to talk about. If you want to adjust the LCD display, you have to install the Thermaltake TT RGB Plus 2 software, so version 2 is needed for this case. And as you can see, it's pretty simple to work out. So you've got the lighting section on here, and then you can choose between the different components you've got installed. So we have the Divider 550TG and the Flow RC Ultra and the Flow RC Ultra RAM, which is all part of the AIO cooler. So what you can do is you could just have a simple, you know, single temperature monitor up there for the CPU, or you can switch that to things like CPU frequency. Click apply. Every time you do it, you have to click apply. Or you could change it to something like the GPU temperature, display the GPU temperature up there. The alternative to that is to choose the carousel option, and that just scrolls through all the different monitoring functions. So you can do that, and you can set the speed that it goes through in you know, seconds, how many seconds it displays each one for. If you don't want diagnostics or monitoring up there, you can put a GIF up there as well, or a JPEG. So you can have something like a WOW on there, or you could put a Thermaltake logo up there to display as well, or you could even choose your own GIF or JPEG to put on there as well. Same goes for the cooler as well, so you can do exactly the same thing. So you can have the CPU temperature up there, or you can have it scrolling through the various different options. Again, you can choose a picture or an image to put on there. You could have whatever that is, I'm not sure what that is, it looks like some snow falling, something like that. Or you could, if you want, have a dog running through a field. You never know, somebody might want a dog running through the field, I don't know. And again, same thing with the RAM cooler as well. You would probably, I'd say you'd probably have your RAM temperature on there, but again, you can choose the carousel option. You can choose a GIF or a JPEG or something to put up there as well. And you can also rotate the display as well. So at the moment I've got it so that it kind of reads correctly, but if you want, you can switch it so that it's on its side or upside down if you wanted to stand on the ceiling and look at your PC. But I think the best way to have it is that way around so you can actually read it. So yeah, that's how that works. Again, the LCD display, it's a bit of a gimmick, but it's probably useful to some people, especially if you've got your system up on the desk and you can see that LCD panel pretty easily. As I've said earlier in the review, I would have liked to been able to move the location of that and have a bit more customization in that respect, but it's there and it's usable and it seems to work well with the software. So just going back to what I touched on earlier with the thermal performance, the case looks great, as I've said, with the tempered glass, shows off the RGB and shows off the components really well. If you are all about the aesthetics, then you're going to like this case. The only downside to that, obviously, is the restriction in airflow because you've only got these small vents down the sides and along the top. As you can see in our thermal performance tests where we run Cinebench R23 stress test and 3D Mark Time Spy Extreme stress test in a loop constantly for 60 minutes, with the case in its default configuration, it does suffer in terms of airflow and in terms of cooling, especially on the CPU. You can see removing panels had a significant effect on the thermal performance. CPU temperature dropped by 6 degrees C delta when we removed the front panel. And removing the top panel was even more significant. We saw a drop there of 9 degrees C on the delta. With the case in its default configuration, the actual component temperature of the CPU was almost hitting 90 degrees at some point, which is a little bit toasty for my liking. Even though this is the 5800X, it is a difficult CPU to cool. I'd like to see it more closer to the 80 degrees C mark rather than 90 degrees. So it is a struggle with this case in terms of thermals. If you wanted to move the AIO to this side panel at the side of the motherboard, mounting the 240 AIO there, it probably would help with the thermal performance because you could pull in cool air from the outside. The only problem with that is, one, you are restricted to a 240mm AIO there, which if you've got a more powerful CPU, you might want a 360 and you can't fit that in. And the other problem as well is it's quite difficult to get the AIO there, especially this one with all the tubes going to the RAM cooler. And also, if you have a long GPU, you're going to be struggling in terms of clearance. The GPU might interfere with the AIO as well, so that's a bit of a problem. So if you're all about the aesthetics and you just care about how the system looks and you want to show off the internals of the system as good as possible, then maybe you might like this case. Maybe if you're using a lower spec CPU that's not as demanding with the heat and the thermal performance, then it might be all right for you. In terms of build quality, it seems pretty solid. No issues installing a system in there, that was all nice and straightforward. But if you are an enthusiast that is looking for a case for raw thermal performance, then I don't think this is for you, but hopefully Thermaltake may release a high airflow version like they did with the Divider 500 TG Air. So let's hope that that comes in the future from Thermaltake. So thanks for watching this review of the Thermaltake Divider 550 TG Ultra. Hope you've enjoyed watching it. If you have, let us know what you think of the case in the comment section. Give us a thumbs up, and also don't forget to subscribe to the channel if you like the content. And if you want to help support Geek Guru, if you enjoy what we do here, then why not head over to our store and pick up some merch, or you could even subscribe to our Patreon. And if you want to catch up on all the in-depth technical reviews, head over to the website.